Hello, welcome everybody. We are launching this new series of podcasts called Boston Leader Voice. This is a podcast where we get together with Boston professionals to discuss important topics that matter to their work and to our audience. In this episode, we are excited to feature Pernille Yilmam. She's a Danish neuroscientist and mental health advocate who transitioned from academia to launching a non-profit startup in Boston called Mind Blossom. Welcome and thank you very much for being with us, Pernille.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, in this episode, we'll be discussing mental health stigma at work, a topic that Pernille has written extensively about. And the first question I wanted to ask you, Pernille, is what are some common forms of mental health discrimination?
Yeah, so mental health discrimination comes in many shapes and forms, and really comes in all of the forms that general discrimination comes in, right? So we're often used to thinking about discrimination as being gendered, being sexual. The discrimination itself can be direct. That can be if in the workplace, for example, that an employer or maybe a colleague is discriminating against you, for example, by firing you, sorry, when they realize that you need to take a medical leave because of an ongoing depression. It might also be that they are taking away your promotion or other opportunities like that. So that would be the direct discrimination. But discrimination can be more subtle too. It can be indirect. That could be, for example, if you have certain policies that are starting to be created or maybe have always been there within an organization that are really favoring people that do not have mental health challenges or other types of disabilities. And then, of course, at the more micro level, we can start talking about discrimination as harassment. So you're being harassed because you have, let's say, a bipolar or schizophrenia, or maybe you're experiencing microaggressions, which is a word that I think a lot of people nowadays are used to thinking about from the racial perspective. But microaggressions can happen to anybody, including people that have mental health challenges.
And how do you think that discriminatory practice manifests, both like explicitly and subtly?
So what we know from a lot of data and research is that the discrimination is happening oftentimes at the more subtle level. So I was just mentioning before that one example of direct discrimination can be if a person is fired. But from the data, we know that people that have mental illnesses are significantly less likely to get promoted. They're significantly more likely to get fired, and they are also more likely not to get hired in the first place. So these are some very clear ways in which mental health is being discriminated against in the workplace very directly. Now, it can be, of course, also more subtle. So, for example, you go to your manager or leader and you're telling them, hey, I'm struggling with the depression, and you're seeing your colleagues move forward with those promotions, but you don't get them. But they, of course, often won't admit that it's because of your mental health challenge. So it can be both very subtle, but also very direct, although most people don't want to admit to it. And I do want to clarify one thing, which is that anybody can discriminate, right? So we can see that both at the leadership and management level, but also at the colleague level as well, like the peer level. But the leadership management level is really where there's a lot of concern.
And jumping to the role of stigma, how does societal stigma around mental health contribute to discriminatory behaviors in professional settings?
Yeah, so I wrote a very long article on Aon about stigma and discrimination at work, and I think there is the first part of this question is defining what is stigma and what is discrimination and how do they work together. So, as we mentioned, discrimination is this very unfair treatment of a person or a group based on characteristics. This could be, for example, based on race or gender, sex, age, whichever. Stigma, on the other hand, is a belief. It is an attitude. So you may have a negative attitude towards a person or a group of people based on characteristics or an attribute. And this could be based on them having a mental illness, which is very common. The clear difference here is that discrimination is an action, stigma is a thought or belief. What we're seeing in the workplace is that a lot of people carry these stigmatizing beliefs, sometimes at a more subconscious level, about mental illnesses, and that drives these discriminatory behaviors. We have a lot of laws that go in and say it's illegal to discriminate, but at the end of the day, these stigmatizing beliefs are still driving the discriminatory behaviors because people have this very rooted understanding of mental illness as being something that really impairs people's performance. So stigma is more difficult to see and much more difficult to quantify, while discrimination is much more tangible. However, it still becomes a huge problem in going in and addressing the discrimination because they're not recognizing that their stigmas are driving those behaviors.
And as a leader trying to create an inclusive work environment, what steps can an employer take to cultivate a more inclusive and supportive environment for employees with mental health conditions?
Yeah, so the easiest step to take, but probably also the most difficult at the same time, is to abide by the anti-discrimination laws in your country. So in the United States, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act that was established back in the 90s. It's also known as the ADA. It posits that you cannot discriminate against and must provide reasonable accommodations to people experiencing disability, which includes mental illness. So this means that if you're a leader, you have one of your employees that shares with you, hey, I have an ongoing depression, I have PTSD, I have another type of mental health challenges, and I need these accommodations. That is something that you can then abide by and actually let them do, get their leave, get their work from home 2 times a week or whatever they need. You would be surprised by how many employers are not abiding by the law and are not providing people with the accommodations that they have a legal right to. Then the second part is, of course, speaking up against the negative attitudes towards mental illness. So now we're talking about how do we address the stigma. So if you are a leader and you're seeing that there is stigma, maybe in yourself, which is very difficult to see, or perhaps you're seeing it in your colleagues, that is something that you can go in and really address through education, or bringing people in that share personal stories.
And going to that part, how can organizations implement effective mental health policies and training programs?
Yeah. So starting with the mental health policies, a lot of companies have pretty good policies nowadays. For example, around leave of absence, but the implementation is really what's lacking. So, for example, most companies in the US, mid and large size, abide by the Family and Medical Leave Act to provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to support their own or someone they love's medical situation. So, in other words, somebody who's struggling with, let's say, depression, can ask for a medical leave of up to 12 weeks, although it's unpaid. However, the problem here is that upon requesting this leave, you have to let the employer know what the reason is. In this case, it could be depression, but the outcome of whether the leave is granted is really dramatically reduced if your reason for the leave is a mental illness, such as PTSD or depression or whatever it is, rather than, for example, cancer. So you really want to keep these things in mind, and really want to think about how can you go in and address those potential areas of discrimination within your mental health policies. Now, rather than focusing on mental health policies, if I were a leader, and I am, but if I were an employer of a larger group of people, I'd emphasize the need for training rather than the mental health policies, especially for the leadership and management levels. And there is a lot of research that's demonstrating that that works. There are really 2 major avenues to address stigma and these ongoing discriminatory behaviors. One of the things that you can implement in your company is developing personal connections with people that have mental illness. Now, this is easier said than done, but the research is showing again and again that if you can go in and work with somebody who has a mental illness of any sort, develop a personal connection with somebody who has a mental illness, that is one of the best ways for you to address your stigmatizing beliefs about people with that sort of mental health challenge. Implementing that is difficult. I recognize that. And it also requires that people feel comfortable to speak up, so that the people in the company feel like saying, hey, I have depression, talk to me about it. That I actually wouldn't recommend that people did that. So probably the route you want to take is the second one, which is education about mental health. This path is also called psychoeducation, and it's very simple. You simply educate people about the facts, the numbers, and some personal stories of what these different types of mental illnesses are, and how they affect people's performance in the work environment. Really, the focus should be on affecting performance and the ability to recover and manage the symptoms as well. So there's a huge amount of evidence that's showing that when you provide this level of education called psychoeducation, it really reduces the discriminatory actions as well as the stigmatizing beliefs.
And talking about speaking up, and I would like to talk to you about empowering employees. And what advice would you offer to individuals who are hesitant to disclose their mental health challenges at work due to fear of discrimination?
Yeah, so I will be really honest with you at this point, because of the rampant discrimination that is going on, I would, under most circumstances, recommend them not to disclose it publicly. I would really say you should keep it for yourself. This goes against how I normally talk about mental health. I'm usually saying you should be outspoken, speak up, but if it puts your job at stake, you have some really, really important decisions to make there. So instead, I would choose a trusted colleague, maybe a manager that you really believe could help advocate for you, and then I would go that route instead, without sharing your personal information with the highest level of leadership. This discrimination, it sometimes is unintentional. It often is unintentional. Like, they don't think through that these stigmatizing beliefs are driving their actions. So keep it to yourself, find a trusted source, and work through it. But there are some horrible stories of how people have been taken advantage of and discriminated against because they speak up and actually share the mental health challenges that they are experiencing.
And how can employees advocate for themselves and others to promote a culture of openness and support?
Yeah. So you could, it's easy to say, start talking about it. Start talking to your colleagues around the lunch table. Start sharing with your leaders stories, maybe not your own, about mental health and mental illness. But I would say that probably the most empowering thing is familiarizing yourself with the ADA, with this anti-discrimination law that you're finding here in the US. It has there Most of the other countries also have a law like that, although many of them are more recent. So I would figure out, what are your rights? What are the accommodations that you can ask for? And to what extent do you actually have to share exactly what's going on with you? I think that's very empowering, and at least creates a safety within yourself. And then starting to speak to your colleagues when you have that level of confidence. Also speaking up when you are hearing other people sharing stigmatizing attitudes or maybe discriminatory behaviors against people with mental illness, right? Knowing what the rights are, not just for yourself, but also for other people.
Thank you. And trying to look forward, what change would you like to see in a workplace culture over the next decade concerning mental health?
A lot. I think the biggest thing I would like to see is that there is an intentional and effective path that companies are utilizing to work towards reducing stigma and then, of course, discrimination. Right now, as I mentioned, there are a lot of good policies in place, and oftentimes they provide various apps, they provide various yoga sessions during lunch hour. I mean, there are all of these small band-aids that are being put on while people are struggling with burnout or whatever other mental illness that they may be experiencing. And it's just not effective to get to the root cause, right? So what I would really like to see is that the leadership of a given company really take an honest look at their policies, but then also, what is the data? How is that showing? Do the people that have mental illnesses not get promoted as much as the people without them? Do you tend to not hire people that have mental illnesses, and all of what that looks like? I think it's very powerful to think about the world of people with disabilities. Oftentimes, when we think of people with disabilities, we specifically think of people with physical disabilities, right? So, like, imagine somebody sitting in a wheelchair. Nowadays, there is much more advocacy for hiring people that have physical disabilities because we recognize they can be amazing workers. Many times, just because you're in a wheelchair, you can still do fantastic work, right? Under the right conditions. Probably somebody in a wheelchair shouldn't work in a construction site, but they can work as a software developer just fine. So getting to that point of thinking about mental illness not as a hindrance, but just as a part of what that person is and what they can do is a really good step in the right direction, which I look forward to seeing.
Thank you. And moving out from the workplace and going to a bigger picture, how do you think society as a whole can contribute to reducing mental health discrimination in professional settings?
Yeah, so I would really go back to what I mentioned before in terms of what employers can do to create a better environment. One, befriend somebody with a mental illness, and this doesn't mean to go out and knock on everybody's door and ask them, do you have a mental illness, and then ask them out for a cup of coffee, but try to build some relationships with a lot of different people, or maybe start asking, because the truth of the matter is that 1 in 5 people globally are struggling with a mental illness, right? This is at the adult level. So you probably have a friend already that has a mental illness. Ask them, learn more about it, establish those personal connections, because that's how we know that we can most effectively reduce stigma. And then the second part is educating yourself. Learn more about what is a mental illness. There's a whole spectrum of mental illnesses, right? Like, mental illness doesn't mean that you're lying on the floor crying all day. Mental illness is something that you live with. For some people, it's a really long time. For some people, it's a short duration and they recover from it, right? So learn about is mental illness something that can be treated? Is it something that can be managed? Who experiences it? Is it a part of a personality trait? All of these questions, there are a lot of answers to them. We have a lot of research, but people don't know it. And oftentimes they have these miscalculated beliefs about what mental illness is and how it affects a person. So educate yourself.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our conversation, Pernille. I want to really thank you for sharing your expertise and for the important work that you are doing at Mind Blossom to make mental health education more accessible.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for the rest of the people, I'll hope you join us next month for the next episode as we continue to explore important topics with fascinating guests. Thank you very much, Pernille.